Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Catherine, who is an advanced photographer from Colorado. Catherine recently created this image on the Mindful Eye's Tetons National Park Workshop. Catherine shot this with the Nikon D700 and used a 70-300 zoom at 300 millimeters and exposed the file at ISO 200 and f8 for 1/500th of a second. Just a couple of quick basic technical things that I wanted to mention here. I'd really encourage you to look up the optical tests that have been done for your specific lenses so that you can know where you have optical aberrations and where you don't. In other words, where you're losing overall sharpness and contrast relative to the different apertures that you might choose on your lens. Typically, lenses are going to perform overall at their worst wide open and stopped all the way down. And just knowing specifically which apertures are the sharpest, which are typically somewhere around a couple of stops down from wide open. That's why we can't just say f5, 6, or f8, because lenses come at all different speeds or all different maximum apertures. But I just really encourage you to look up that information online, particularly when you're shooting scenes like this. That kind of information becomes very powerful. What am I talking about? I'm talking about scenes where we're not so much concerned with a flow of focus. We're not so much concerned with either a shallow depth of field or a great depth of field, because we're pointing our lens very far away from the camera relative to our focal length. And we're shooting in infinity, where if we focus to infinity, we're very likely to get everything close to very sharp. Then we just want an overall sharp aperture. I wanted to mention that in today's critique. Also just wanted to mention the basic idea of how working with a long focal length, we can create the illusion of subjects from near to far being compressed on top of each other and sort of flattening out, so we can create more of a feeling of a flat filled design of just space shapes or colors. And Catherine has done that here to beautiful effect. In addition to this sort of illusion of these subjects being compressed and being on top of each other. So in other words, if we were much closer to these trees with the wide lens, they would appear to be much further stretched out from each other. In addition to that, Catherine is working with several other design concepts here in a very powerful way. She's using the long lens to simplify by just shooting a small section of a very, very big dramatic landscape with a lot of ideas. She's also using the idea of the major diagonal within the frame in a powerful way, in a repetitive way. So this diagonal to create the feeling of being able to move through this image. On the z-axis, we have three potential ways to move through an image. The first two are very obvious. The x-axis side to side, the y-axis up and down. A real powerful thing to do in photography is to create the illusion for the viewer that they can actually move through this two-dimensional artifact called the photograph, and lines that move on the diagonal can help to do that. Another powerful thing about working with the diagonal is that using diagonals can help to create a sense of visual closure or unity for the viewer. Catherine is also working with the repetition of these diagonal positive and negative space shapes that keep playing out in the image. She's also working with the idea of color that goes from warm back to cool back to warm. That can help to create a feeling of depth and also visual excitement. Something else that I love that Catherine has done here, she has a fairly formally symmetrical composition. If we were talking about back and forth on this diagonal, you can see how these ideas are in sort of a formally symmetrical way, reflecting back and forth across this line in the middle, and then in the diagonal line close to the middle of the frame. Or we could say that this is movement from sort of one point that would create a minor diagonal to another. She has this sort of halfway point with the fir trees that are very dark to sort of create a visual anchor in the middle of this transition of repeating diagonal space shapes and lines. And I think that's very, very powerful in this composition. There are a couple of things that I think that we could do to this to create a different variation in a perfect world, might create even more of an exciting version of the image. Be curious to hear your feedback about that. One is one of the most powerful tools in any image editing program. That's just the crop tool. And one of the things that I think about when I look at this image is potentially cropping down from the top. This space shape up here is very large. The space shape of the sky, we could call this negative space around the top of the mountains here. And the top of the frame is already very visually heavy, much heavier than the bottom. and this space shape is one of the largest space shapes in the image. So just for the sake of balance from top to bottom, I could see making a crop somewhere right in here. And the other thing that I think a crop in that area would do is create a space shape at the top that does a more dynamic job of rhyming this space shape here, this negative space shape of the sage on the hill. And I think it may also create more of a feeling of this little bit of orange aspen in the bottom right corner playing off of the peak of the mountain, just tighten the composition up. So I'm just going to do that crop, and just to see what you think here, coming down to somewhere like this and applying the crop. So there's before and there's after. Be curious to hear your feedback about that. The next thing that I'm going to do is, to me, a very, very powerful way inside of Photoshop to get rid of color cast very quickly. I'm just going to go to the Adjustment Layers panel inside of CS4. I'm going to click on the Curves tool, and it's these three eyedroppers here that I want to talk about very quickly. If I click on this icon, I can use the eyedropper tool to set a black point in the image. If I click here, I can sample in the image to set a gray point, and if I click here, I can sample in the image to set a white point. To me, the mountains represent the potential for using the set a gray point tool. So I click here, come out into here on the surface of the mountain itself in an area that I would like to be neutral gray, and click, and to me that one move in a lot of ways gets rid of a red color cast and starts to make the idea of movement of color even more dynamic in the image. A lot of people that teach Photoshop will sometimes encourage you to avoid these tools and to go inside of the channels on levels and curves and to use those to correct color in a very specific way. Have nothing against that, but it's pretty complicated. And this is a much less complicated way to do it. And one of the things I love about these eyedroppers is it can be a very quick way to overall white balance an image. Because we're working on an adjustment layer, I can apply that change locally. So it could also be a very quick way to get rid of a color cast within a local area of an image. And because this is on a layer adjustment, obviously I can modify my adjustment here. Have black as my foreground color. I can hit B for the brush tool, get a little bit bigger brush. I can go to an opacity of somewhere around 30% by hitting the 3 key, and I could now, painting with black on that mask, paint in some of the warmth in the original capture on the layer below. So I could come back in and give, let's say, the orange area with an aspen a little bit of pop. And let's say I don't want this guy to be quite so cyan. I do want to warm it back up a little bit. I could go to 20% here, something like that, and just give this a touch of some warmth in the blue to warm that blue back up a little bit and apply this change that happened globally in more of a local way. And so much of the time color cast will rob our image of a lot of depth. Instead of colors being a place that you go to in the image, if we have a color cast, there's this overall feeling of color that keeps separation and keeps image depth from happening. Just something to think about in terms of maybe white balancing inside of Photoshop. Really love what Catherine has done here. Very beautiful image, very simple, really powerful use of color, the long lens, framing, working with the diagonal to create a very graphic and beautiful scene out of a much, much larger potential sort of field of view here. It could be very enticing to get more information. I want to say a big thank you to Catherine for participating in our Tetons National Park workshop, and everybody who participated. To say that we had a lot of fun on this workshop would be an understatement for all time. Just very, very thankful to everybody who was there, and we hope to see you again very soon on the Mindful Eyes Daily Critique.